Thank you. And we have apologies from Suzanne today for urgent family reasons, and Ian as well, who's on vacation. I'm going to move the agenda around a little bit. So after the minutes and the matters arising, we're going to go straight to the Chief Executive's report, because Iffy will have to leave us early because he's being very humble about this, but he's actually going to the Royal College of Psychiatry to receive a medal from the Royal College of Psychiatry. So he's being a bit too humble for this. But... So I think that we ought to all be basking in Iffy's reflected glory at this moment in time. So a little bit of embarrassment is a good thing here. I think so. Well done. Okay, so any declarations of interest that aren't routine or specifically raised by items on the agenda? No. Minutes of the last meeting. Are people, first of all, happy to approve these as an accurate record of the last meeting? Thank you very much. Matters arising, so I'm having trouble navigating to that. I've lost the matters arising. Are people happy with the matters arising? As I recall them when we went through them, they were all in hand. Thank you very much. There was People's Committee. These were all in hand and had dates to complete them. Are people happy with that? Thank you. Okay, Iffy, over to you for the Chief Executive's report.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So just to help colleagues, you'll find my paper from page 48 to 57 of the bundle. So just a few things I'd like to highlight from my paper. You will, of course, notice that I started with the 10-year plan consultation. I'm really pleased that we've done the exercise now. So we can send that off when the time comes. There are a couple of reports I want to draw attention to, and I think that they both complement the DASI report. One is the state of care report from the CQC. The second is the Health Services Safety Investigations report that focuses on mental health inpatient settings. Of course, they both highlight serious issues in the NHS, very similar to what Darcy mentioned. And we've agreed as an exec that we'll look more closely at the Health Services Safety Investigation report, and that our assessment of our services will be reviewed in subgroups and then taken to the quality committee. One of my concerns is that we may not have adequate multidisciplinary working in our inpatient areas. We may not have substantive staff who work in our inpatient area, but I hope that my colleagues through the acute care forum and then the quality committee will be able to give that a thorough review. So you'll be aware that the budget was announced a week ago. We're still trying to figure out exactly what this means for the NHS. My rough working, which I checked by text with Azra, is that if we don't have any money from the Center for Staff Pay Award, and we also have to pick up the increase in NI contributions, that's probably of the order of £5 million to our pay bill. But I'm sure that at the appropriate time, when Azra has more information about what this will mean for Oxleas, we will hear all of that. Something that's not in my report that I think I'd like to share with the board is the work that the ICS is doing about longer term sustainability, by which I mean 5 years and beyond, what's called the system sustainability work that we're doing. 33 or so areas have been identified across Southeast London. So this includes acute, also as community and mental health provider and the ICS to review those areas to see whether there are any efficiencies we can make, which could be cost reduction or efficiencies for the future to help us bridge what we think is at least a 300 million gap that's likely to come our way. We had a really interesting meeting yesterday, Slam and ourselves, and we had ICS colleagues who were present. We had the place lead for mental health present, where we reviewed 6 broad areas for mental health, and we agreed that there are 3 areas we think we need to, across as 2 organizations who provide mental health, look into, one being community mental health, the other being crisis, and the third being CAMS, and that we will build some more, we need to do some more work to clarify exactly what it is we want to do in those areas, to look at the financial implications and see whether we're going to be able to make sufficient cost reductions and efficiencies that will put us in a good position going forward, both to manage demand, because I think that's a real issue, and provide high quality care that doesn't have a great deal of variation across our 6 boroughs. So we will probably be in a position by early December to have more detail on that, and I'm sure we'll share that with board members. 2 final things I just want to draw attention to. One is a successful annual members meeting and the really lovely digital showcase, thanks to Alison and her team. Was quite inspirational. Lots of colleagues who were there thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity. We captured Andrew trying virtual reality.
To change a tire.
Yes, and you'll find in the park that we're going to have the staff event in early December, the Oxleas Recognition Awards, and you see the detail of those who've been shortlisted. And then finally, just to draw attention to our annual NHS England Emergency Planning, Resilience and Response Annual Assurance Report. My God, which when you read it, you'll agree is really quite positive. And that's all I wanted to say. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ife. Questions or comments for Ife? And I think one of the things I would find interesting, Ife, is because I was at a chairs meeting yesterday, and the various initiatives across the ICB, as you describe, across all, what were 33 of them, which are being boiled down to a smaller number that people will concentrate on. What I couldn't get any idea of was what the quantum of those was. I mean, are these things that are going to make a difference to the ICB's finances, or are they pretty incremental?
I'm sure Azra will want to comment on this. So certainly our understanding is that each organization still has to do their absolute best to achieve financial balance. So we need to continue with our SIPs year on year. But this is over and above that. The last meeting we had, it was estimated, and this was just broad estimate, that if we were successful in addressing those 33 items, we may be able to save £100 million. But the detailed working is yet to come. And that doesn't include what we just agreed yesterday, although we doubt very much that what we agreed yesterday is going to save a lot of money. We think that what we agreed yesterday will help us manage the demand, the rising demand, and by so doing, we will not necessarily need to have more money come in to deal with the demand. And secondly, like I said, you have some degree of uniformity across our 6 boroughs. And if we are successful in making sure that there's less variation and that we're practicing in line with guidelines, then you would hope that there'll be good outcomes for our patients.
That's what you want.
Yeah, so I just wanted to firstly address the 5 million that if you had talked about the pay awards and the national insurance increase. So I believe the 22 billion that was referred to that was coming into the NHS is supposed to cover the national insurance increase. So we shall wait and see as that comes through. The figure that we think is going to be the shortfall on the pay awards is about £2 million. That includes everything, including the junior doctors, resident doctors, must remember the new terminology, resident doctors uplifts that we will be seeing next month. We've just got a little bit of NHSE money to come through. Now that is the 2 million based on if all of our budgeted posts were filled. So it'll be a little bit less than that in terms of actuals, but that's broadly what that's going to have to be dealt with both this year and ongoing. The secondary one was around the 300 million that Iffy had quoted. So that 300 million came from when we last did a medium-term financial strategy. And that was completely predicated on every organisation achieving their financial plan for 24-25. I think we can rest, and what's more, doing that recurrently. We are not in that position at this point. So we're just refreshing now the medium-term financial strategy again, covering the next 5 years. And I do believe that 300 million will go up significantly.
Yeah, thank you. That's a bit of a shortfall, that £2 million, isn't it? And I'm sure there'll be a shortfall on the national insurance, because even if our national insurance is funded, it's the funding of the people who provide services into us for our commission services as well. I was going to ask a question, and it's interesting you mentioned the meeting with SLAM. I was asking a question about the South East London transformation plan for children and young people's mental health and emotional wellbeing services, which I thought sounded a good thing. And if you look at what's in that paragraph, some of the things that we were talking about earlier in terms of a 10-year plan. And then what I'm hearing is, and so my question when I read the papers was, does this come with any money? And then what I'm hearing is a task on CAMS to reduce spend, which feels quite scary actually, because I don't think we sit here thinking it's particularly well funded. So I wanted to know a bit more about this plan and what impact it would have, and particularly how now that fits with that ambition to cut cost.
So there's no new money, is the first thing to say. But we're hoping that by working together, in fact, yesterday when we had this discussion, quite a few people said, well, why don't we throw it all up in the air and redesign services? We could do that. But I think by working together, we want to identify the really good practices or models of care that exist. There are some out there that haven't been adopted fully across our boroughs. Bexley has adopted, for example, I Thrive. It's making a difference. So how can we make sure that that's spread right across? And we need to do those things first and also reduce waiting times for our young people to then see where we end up. This morning I had a meeting because there's another piece of work that's going on across London about how we prioritize children's mental health services, and it's how do we make sure that it all stacks up and that people are doing different things. And I think we're probably going to, across London, continue to push I Thrive, which is about what do you get in the community to increase resilience, how do you detect things early, give support in schools, how do we make sure that when people need more, that they get ready access, and then all the way to tier 4. The bit that I suspect we may struggle slightly with is there is a need to provide other sorts of services or additional services in the community for young people so that their use of inpatient beds reduces further. So maybe for Oxleas, for example, we've had some money to create a home treatment team. We've not been able to find staff. There's conversation about do we need some kind of intensive support, a certified outreach type team? And then there's a third, which is do we need a team that addresses children with more complex needs, including ASD, etc. So we're not sure how we're going to find the money for those, but as part of the SLP for South East London, there may be a way through that, but we haven't quite worked it out. But I think the long and short of this is no more money, but can we use the money we've got to do things differently?
as we start to think about how we redesign services, how do we ensure that digital are involved from the outset? Because I think often when we redesign services, digital is a bit of an afterthought. And I think there are real opportunities to kind of weave different ways of working through these pathways. But that's only really possible if you really think about it from the outset.
You're absolutely right. And I'm really keen as we have these conversations that digital, but inevitably it's got to be you or someone from your team who joins so that we don't lose sight of that. So if you think about what I've said about children's, there's a great deal that we could be doing in terms of using digital to support them, support parents, etc., and also use digital approaches in our delivery of care. And even in the discussions we had earlier about hospital to community, the whole thing about how do we make sure that across community that people can see records, how do we support? So you're right. I actually think that we often don't draw digital in enough because we should be doing that at the outset, and so we just need to try and make sure we remember that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think as well, we need to think about digital as well in the way in which we use digital processes, not just the technology, but the iterate and try, iterate, evaluate type of things. Sophie?
Yes. Do we know anyone else that's doing this? Are there any examples of good practice in other ICSs across the country?
I'm sure there are. So the other day, Andrew and I were in a discussion about integrated neighborhood teams, which is another place where I think we need to get digital in. And I think, Alison, you and I have exchanged emails. But I'm struggling to find anywhere where it's been done really well, and I think that that's part of what we need to do across the system. Fortunately for us in Southeast London, Andrew Bland leads that. And so I hope that through his leadership that he will identify places. People have talked about Birmingham. Someone talked about Northwest London the other day, but when you ask more questions, it's not really fully formed. So that's one example. For children, I think that there are some examples, but not of everything. So it's about how do we I talked about my meeting this morning, which is about how does NHS England help us put together a portfolio of where things are being done that we can look at. But we also agree that across London, across the mental health providers, we need to just do a bit of exercise to understand what people are doing and see what we can learn from each other.
If I could jump in there as well, because I think one of my reflections on being in lots of meetings and chairs now where people say we've had this initiative in this area and it's worked really well or it hasn't worked very well or whatever, very rarely do people actually define what the benefits are of the change that they're doing. And so very rarely is it possible at the end of the day to know whether the change has had the benefit it's wanted. People sort of wave their hands and says, oh, it's better or it's not better. And I think that we need to be more rigorous about turning around and defining those benefits, potential benefits, and then working out whether our changes have done them. There's rather too many good wheezes that people put in board. Any other questions or comments for Iffy? No, thank you. If you want to do the board assurance framework, which is item number 5.
Thank you again, Chair. So I think that the paper is fairly clear. I'm just trying to find the page so I can point you to the right page 20. And as we often do at this board, on this occasion, we would like the chairs and exec leads to present their risks, but just to help give the highlights, you'll see that there are 12 risks in total. 4 of the 12 are significant, 5 are high, and 3 are moderate. You'll also see that the People Committee has de-escalated 1 risk since our last, have actually closed 1 risk since our last meeting, which is the Junior Doctors Industrial Action. And so what I hope that we can do now is to go from committee chair to committee chair or exec, as is set out in the paper, starting with business and infrastructure, then quality and people, and just have colleagues speak about their risks, paying particular attention to the significant ones, if that's okay.
Great. So I'll start. So, I mean, not a huge amount of change in Business and Infrastructure Committee risks. So taking them one by one, clearly longer term financial sustainability is absolutely key. And I think that's particularly in focus at the moment because we are really making very limited inroads into our SIP target at the moment. I don't think that's for the want of trying, but clearly there is an awful lot of pressure on services. We've talked in Business and Infrastructure Committee about work that is ongoing at the moment, which is rather than looking for quick wins, and any quick wins are appreciated, it's more looking at how services can be configured to meet demand. So it's sort of demand and capacity reviews, and how we can adapt workforce, for example, so that our services are fit for sort of current requirements. And if we then look at productivity measures on that, there could be some opportunities there. But it is really tricky, and the sort of shortfall of funding on the pay review will not only affect this year, but also add to that burden going forward. And I would expect there to be a shortfall on the national insurance as well, unless there's significant mitigations that come through on that. I don't think this puts us desperately different to other trusts, and clearly, we, in terms of this year, which is the next risk, we think we should be okay, although this shortfall on the pay review funding is an issue. I think we know within the ICS that other trusts are struggling to meet their budgets and forecasts for this year. So we know that can also then create further pressure on us to do more. So it's a very tricky environment. If we move on then, so revenue and capital plan delivery for this year, subject to us finding a way around this shortfall on the pay review and understanding that, I think we have enough in play that will mean that we can deliver this year's plan. But as I said, what we're not doing is we're not delivering that by the recurrent SIPs. In terms of the capital regime, this really is a longer term risk. So in terms of capital plan delivery for this year, we think we'll hit our target, and that includes some strategic work on this site as well. In terms of the longer term, we look ahead and see some quite choppy water in terms of us being able to spend the level of capital that we need, both to keep our physical infrastructure where it needs to be, and also to get our digital infrastructure carrying on and improving. Clearly, we've invested on the digital side an awful lot in the last few years since COVID. As we all know from our own life, digital equipment like that doesn't last forever. It has to be renewed, and that creates sort of a capital burden really to stand still. So we know that capital targets are now negotiated on an ICS basis. We have the cash, as we know, but we need to continue to push our case as strongly as possible to make sure we can achieve what we need to achieve. Moving further on, Bexley Private Finance Initiative, we know this is a significant issue as we come towards break clauses on those contracts. We've got a paper in Part B where we can pick up a specific item on that. The contracts are significant, potential amounts of money involved in them are significant as well. Cyber, it's difficult to say much about cyber. We think generally we are in a reasonable position. We've had some further work done at ICS level, which indicates we have perhaps some way to go in some areas to evidence where we are, rather than to do anything drastically different. And there is going to be an increased cyber focus in terms of the ICS and the sort of the toolkit sign off. But I think we continue to perform well in that area, but this is a risk where the environment only gets worse. So it's not one where we can plateau. We have to always be aware of this worsening in the outside environment, because we're only as good as how we can defend against new threats, which we don't yet know about. And then finally, achieving carbon zero. This is still high. I think the positives on this is, as we do capital schemes, we are baking in quite a lot of decarbonisation work where we're doing that. So windows, I think we're doing some really good work at Memorial in terms of moving ahead. But we know, and this comes back to the capital piece, to really make our ambitions, at some point in the next 10 years, we're going to need significant investment in new technologies, new ways of heating, lighting, etc., to move forward. We are looking to use land here to provide, what do you call them? Solar arrays, which would be quite good. But, you know, then these are quite big, chunky items. And not cheap. We hope they'll get cheaper, but there's a point at which you have to actually say, we need to start doing some of that. Azra.
So I think you've covered it. I wasn't going to add anything to that, and I think that probably holds true, I'm hoping, for both Alison and Rachel, because I think that was a really good summary.
I can cover part of this, but I will look to Lorraine standing in to Ian and to other colleagues as well, because I didn't realise I was covering this as part of the agenda, so it has been suddenly thrown at me. Looking at bed management, Jim, you may be able to help here as well. So I understand this is shared really between quality and finance, and I believe at our last quality committee we were discussing how that actually worked, because clearly how our bed occupancy and how we manage our beds has an impact on the quality of care for our patients, but also on our financial stability. So we do recognise that, and we have robust programmes in place, particularly to decrease our use of private beds and to look at who is actually occupying our beds. And there is a rise in working age adults, for example. Our target is to reduce this 2025 and to reduce our use of private beds to zero. And we are performing well against this, but it's not a completely easy trajectory. It does go up and down. So Azra and Lorraine and other colleagues, would you like to add to that?
I think only to say that one of the key enablers to us kind of managing that bed base was the conversion of one of our wards into a different type of ward. And I understand, Azra, that we've been successful in getting some capital money in order to do that. So that's seen as quite a positive driver in terms of the April 25 target.
So yes, we have. We've received 200,000. I think that will allow some of the minimum changes that were required to that ward, because in order to make it absolutely perfect was going to require significantly more capital than we had been able to secure.
So moving on to the next, which is Southwest Prisons, and this is where I will ask for colleague support as well. At the last quality committee, we did discuss and realised that all but one of the actions are complete. However, we did consider whether this should be reframed to cover prisons in the southeast as well as the southwest, given the recent inspection result. And you can see the outcome of that discussion at the when we go over the quality committee notes. We also wanted to defer discussion until the new director was in post. I'm sorry, I'm just literally reading what is on there, but that is actually what I think an accurate summary of the situation at the moment. But Jim, do you want to add to that?
Just to add to that, I think progress has been really, really good in the Southwest in terms of getting to grip with the new prison estate, getting the staff on board and integrating across, let's say, the southeast and southwest. So I think that the paperwork that we're getting through at the moment is there's action plans in place, and those action plans are actually working.
Finally, the harm to triangle of care due to poor communication. So this is one that's very close to my heart, and I know that Neil has also done a huge amount of work on this, as have other colleagues. And this is particularly important because it was co-designed, as you know, by the Service User and Carer Shadow Committee, and there was quite a bit of work in getting the way it was articulated correct, but also looking at how we actually measure this, because this is a wonderful aspiration, but it is something that we do really need to think about evidencing to make sure that we can demonstrate that we're mitigating it. So we looked at the renewed focus here on the documentation and the use of the audit tool and making sure that we triangulate the data as well. And there was really a discussion as well about how to gather that data, because it's all very well having these tools in place, but how do we make sure that we get carer buy-in? So the clinical effectiveness group also involved in that around the care planning documentation. And I think we should mention our involved team as well, and the work that they have done on engaging patients and carers and staff on the importance of involving patients and carers. So we're looking forward to seeing increased data on that. We think that that level of risk is sufficient, and there's been a lot of work put into it.
Thank you. People committees, I'm not sure, Nina, are you able to?
I'm going to lead on that.
You can lead.
Right.
Okay.
So we've just been through the fantastic process of testing some of these risks with a shadow user and carer committee, and we had really brilliant insight from them, and the update to the articulation of our BAF will come to the next people committee. What they particularly wanted us to bring out, particularly around the first risk around staffing, was the impact on patients. And I think we often talk about the impact on the quality of care, but what they really brought out was the impact on the continuity of care as well, which was really key to them. And that's probably a focus that we haven't brought out as much previously, and we will going forward. They also wanted more granularity about some of the areas that we were focusing on. So in terms of the staffing risk, which is 1213, this falls into focus around recruitment and focus around retention. And you know a lot of what we're doing in this space. So I'm just going to really highlight the new areas that we've been adding into, if that's all right. So as you know, on recruitment, there's been a massive focus on trying to raise our profile, and that's proving to be pretty successful. We do hear quite a lot from new joiners that they join us because they've heard good things about Oxleas. Some of the new things that we're doing is some films that we're designing for some of our harder to recruit areas like district nursing and children and young people, to try and really bring to life for people what it's like to work in those settings. And it's not always easy for people to understand that. We're also looking, for example, at changing how we engage with LinkedIn. It seems to be growing much more in profile, particularly across the NHS, as a means of reaching people, particularly now that kind of Twitter, the other social media platforms aren't as consistently used as they used to be, perhaps, and so we're seeing LinkedIn as a way forward for us. On retention, obviously there's been a lot of work in this area to do with wellbeing, to do with inclusion, but things that I would really bring out about what we're focusing on at the moment is around induction and flexible working, and those are areas that we're kind of really starting to really motor on, I think, and some opportunities for us to be doing things a bit differently. On the 1471 risk around discrimination, as you all know, we've got a Building a Fairer Oxleas programme that we try to make sure is bigger every year than the year before, so that it continues to have real impact. And we really want that sense of momentum in this area, because if we take our eye off the ball on this, we will slip backwards exceptionally quickly. What I wanted to highlight are the new areas that we're focusing on. So in December, we will be launching a Smashing It programme, which was designed in light of the race work that we've done with the Mayor of London. And this is to really help people who perhaps don't have confidence about applying for roles, to know what the top tips are, how to design their CVs, how to approach the design of their examples, how to make sure that if you apply for a role and you don't get it, you don't immediately think you're never going to get it, because it can often take time to do these things, and to encourage people to kind of brush themselves off, learn from the experience and to apply again. So that's a big programme we'll be launching. We are doing some really thoughtful work based on experience-based co-design that Neil is leading, and it's a really fantastic bit of work about how people raise issues about racism. And we know that at the moment those systems aren't working well. People who raise either formally or informally about racism end up not feeling heard and not feeling as though their voice has come through clearly enough and that the impact has been properly understood. So we're working with people who have been in that position to help them redesign our processes. We're doing some targeting work in forensics around culture that Abby and Neil are leading on, and we're likely to be doing something very similar in acute and crisis. We've got some new funds that we've bid for to help those people who might have felt broken by the discrimination that they've experienced in the past, to try and help rebuild, and that's something we're really committed to. And we're also seeing a lot of focus coming through in complaints and cases, HR cases about neurodiversity, and I think there's a real upskilling of our staff about what we do around neurodiversity. So this is an area that will grow and grow, and we've got a lot of plans in that space. And then finally on violence and abuse, which is 2307, and Jane, do please add anything that you want to add. But I think the progress we're making here is that we have a very lively group who come together that go right across the whole organisation, where we really focus on issues about reducing violence and aggression. We look at the data that comes through and where the hotspots are. We've got directorate leads who understand their own context, because violence and abuse in the context of district nursing is very different to in the context of inpatients, in the context of what people might do if they're kind of an online or a phone kind of service. So we have directorate leads that enable them to really think about what does reducing violence and abuse mean in that particular setting. And we've also got a much broader kind of preventative approach that's based on relational security and trauma-informed care. And we are real thought leaders in this space, particularly Naidu and others. There are some really people in Oxleas who are really leading the way on some of these areas. Jane, is there anything you want to add?
Thank you. There is some really great work going on. A couple of things I just wanted to highlight in addition is that we have had our very first face-to-face Schwartz round for people who have experienced violence and abuse at work. And it was held at Green Parks House, I believe, the first one. Very, very well received. And we're hoping that it's replicated face-to-face in the other units. And it was quite groundbreaking for us, because until then they've been virtual. So it not only raised the awareness of the Schwartz round, but also enabled people to really sort of reflect on their feelings and resonate on how their experiences were. The other thing we're really working on is the support when an incident has happened, making sure that the flowchart that we've got in place really is being used by people and getting feedback on the support that's being given. And some directorates are really, really focused on monitoring the steps and getting that feedback and really engaging in that feedback from people who've been affected, which has been great. And that's been shared with us as well. And the final thing is there's obviously the national focus on sexual safety, which is now forming a big part of this work. And we have signed up to the Sexual Safety Charter a good year or so ago, and we're about to launch some resources to support that agenda as well.
Can I ask a question about 1213, the vacancies and recruitment pressures? I'm very happy that we're doing, with the work and so on. My question is that given the height of that risk and all of the stickies that were about workforce, which was around this area, is that BAF granular enough? Because we're looking at different professions, we're looking at recruitment, we're looking at retention, we're looking at different sectors within it. I'm not necessarily wanting to multiply BAF risks, but I'm just wondering whether I guess I'm wanting assurance that we're looking at this at a granular enough level to pick up all of the individual nuances. And I'll turn to Nina after this. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, I should have brought Nina in at the end. My apologies, Nina. We have a people strategy as well, which underpins some of this work, which is being reviewed in light of our new strategy. So that should have that granular detail, but how we represent that in the BAF, I'm very happy for us to look at that differently if you think we need a bit more detail.
I'll turn to Nina, and then I'll ask people around the table that specific question. Nina.
Someone who is myself a carer, both in terms of parents and in terms of children, I went into that thinking I probably have a reasonably good grip of the sorts of issues that they might raise. It was one of the most powerful, humbling sessions that I have sat in on since being at Oxleas. And Rachel absolutely touched on the point around the flip side of vacancies and recruitment pressures and how continuity of care or lack thereof impacts on service users and carers. One of the other points that was made that was very powerful was when we talk about violence and aggression and abuse, maybe we don't recognise, and this is a discussion that we need to have at People Committee on the 20th, maybe we don't recognise the state that people are in at the point by the point at which they access our services, what has gone before, the waiting times, the very difficult experiences they've had to manage. So an element of validating their experiences, and I know we touched on that very early on in the September board meeting, and a recognition that different cultures will express their frustration in different ways, and some of that might come across as abusive. Clearly not to take away from the fact that it's not okay, but more that we can do in that respect, I think. The broader point that I was going to make on our risks was they have all been on the BAF for a while now, and I do believe, and for those of you who've looked at the sheet that shows how we track over a period of time, they've remained relatively static for the last year. So I wonder whether we do need to also have a discussion around to what extent are these actually issues that we're managing, rather than risks that we're seeking to avoid crystallization, because I think many of them have crystallized. So I think it's important to be able to make that distinction.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm obviously new to all of this. I'm discovering the BAF, and I'm pleased to see that it reconciles with all the discussions I've had as part of my induction discussion, so which is reassuring. 3 questions on the PFI. Do we have a good understanding of the different scenarios and downside risks, or is it still very speculative in terms of what the downside risks are in terms of cash, revenue, and capital? And on the triangle, I'm sorry, of care, how do we measure success? How do we mitigate the risks? It looks quite challenging.
I think on the PFI question, we are currently working through the options so that we're really clear about the possible options for each individual site, because it's not a contract-based discussion, it's an individual site-based discussion. So we're working through all those options at the moment with our advisors, and then we'll have much greater clarity about the financial impact of each of those decisions. Just to add, we've got a range within those options depending on where the negotiations flow. I can certainly brief you outside of that, because those are obviously commercial and sensitive at this moment in time.
So, Damien, yes, Suzanne and I are due to meet in 3 weeks' time to see how we would measure this, because we have to look at it from different points of view. So we have to look at it from the carer's point of view, from the patient's point of view, and then from the staffing and our documentation. And just as it says, triangulate and bring it all together in a meaningful way so that we can see the baseline and then the kind of impact of any intervention that we have put in. But we will, once we've had that meeting, we'll be able to crystallize it. It will come into the quality committee and then we'll bring it back here.
Anything else?
Nothing else, just to say thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And thank you, Sophie, for stepping in at last minute as well. Appreciate it. Okay, thank you. We'll now move back in the agenda to item number 4, which is a service user and carer involvement focus. Neil, over to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. So the user involvement presentation today is about our peer engagement facilitator, PEF. service. So we did bring this about 18 months ago in an early stage of the project. Worth giving the context that the PEF is funded by NHS England. NHS England actually control this quite carefully by asking a number of questions about the experience of people on the PEF program, but also how their experience is used within organizations. And when we last brought it here, we brought forward some of the evaluations, and we're pleased to say that not only did we pass, but we had increased funding from NHS England because of the way people were used, their experiences used, and the way that they were supported, trained, and looked after. That's in the context of some organisations losing their funding. So it's a serious test that we not only passed, but we exceeded in. And what that allowed us to do, and you'll see in the film today, is to employ somebody to really support staff in being able to engage PEFs in the roles, because we had a lot of appetite from staff about saying we really could do with some help from somebody. You know, colleagues might remember that you get 15 hours paid for by NHS England for people in these roles. Staff could see lots of opportunities, but staff were just so busy that they couldn't quite make it happen. So we have a make it happen role within involved now. And in terms of the presentation today, we were going to focus on our work with QI and how we're linking in with making that co-produced. Based around an event that was due to happen in October. That's been bumped on to November. But what we want to show you is a more general presentation about an event that we had about a month ago, where we look at how people are being used across the service in these PEF roles. So key things to remember is NHS funded and NHS England funded, the implementation of a new role. And you'll see in the event staff talking about the kind of roles that they are using PEFs in and about the experience that PEFs themselves have in this. And I think it's very relevant to our conversations about workforce and about linking with community. So I'm going to show it on that screen.
The Peer Engagement Facilitator project was set up about 2 to 3 years ago. And essentially, when we were going out to teams and we were talking to teams about how lived experience could be put to use in your teams, the team members said to us that there are lots of things that they would like to be able to do with the service users and carers, but they don't necessarily have the time. So the intention's there, the motivation's there to do more and to do better for the patients, but not necessarily the resource or the time. So in our construction of the PEF project, that's essentially what we wanted to bring in. So we brought in the element of a facilitator with lived experience. So a person who is a peer and they go through the peer support training, bringing in those skills about how to utilize their lived experience in something that is effective and impactful for the person who's receiving it.
Having a PEF on board is really helpful for picking up even more co-production and looking and working with the patients and carers within the trust. For us, it's really helpful to have co-production in the team so that we can work on training and looking at visits and having their input and perspective all the time.
At the end of the day, this is all about patients. This is about patient health outcomes, this is about recovery, this is about incorporating nature-based solutions to rehabilitation and therapy. And who best to advise that than the person who might benefit?
I think the event today is really been a way to showcase and highlight what people have managed to achieve in their one-year placements. It's very meaningful and it's very touching to see how far people have come, because I've met with all of these peer engagement facilitators when they first join. So I'll see them at the meet and greet session, and then I'll see them today where they're standing in front of a group of almost 50 people and talking about their experiences, and nothing beats that. I think it's amazing for them and also for me to see as someone who's seen them go through that journey.
I mean, I've changed as a person, mentally, physically, it changes the whole of you, because you've got your confidence, you make new friends, you find out new things about yourself as well as the people you're working with, and what you find out about yourself can help those you're working with as well. So it's just this really nice circle, and it just keeps going round and round.
I think what really has an impact in terms of showing the success of the project is how many of the PEFs are now working in Oxleas as substantive staff members. And that's only happened because they've been given the opportunity to prove themselves and also to gain the transferable skills that now they are forming the future workforce in Oxleas. So I think that's a real positive, and it shows that Oxleas is truly modelling itself as an anchor institute in terms of providing employment opportunities for people with lived experience.
I get new skills, knowledge about how to run the projects, what involvements are, and what skills I could use in the future, and what skills I can use what I already got.
You're going to learn so much about the company itself and the different services which have been offered, and how those services have been delivered to patients and teams. So it's such a wonderful, it gives you the diverse knowledge to which you can be very, very important for transferable skills.
I think just meeting the carers, just communicating with them, talking to them, getting their experiences, and even sharing my experiences as well. It's just free. You're free to talk, and you don't feel like you're restricted in what you say.
This is an amazing project. I gained so much energy from the PEFs. And I know I see their journey, but I also see the challenges that lots of people have had to go through. And it means a lot, not just to them, but to the trust to be able to provide them with this opportunity. And some people have had really difficult backgrounds, really challenging and difficult backgrounds. And they've managed to overcome all of that and do something for themselves and really put into practice their lived experience for the benefit of others.
You get to watch this person evolve into somebody so confident. I mean, when Diana came to me, to speak to Diana, she wouldn't even give you eye contact. And I've watched this woman go out and just help carers in every way that she can. She's a very passionate person, and she's just there. Anytime I need anything done, she'll be there asking me how she can help. Yeah, so it's a fantastic program, and you get so much out of it, and your PEF gets so much out of it also.
It's sharing experience. It's sharing experience and giving reassurance that there are better places in life, not just the ground bottom. Yeah, if you hit the ground bottom, there is only way up.
So it's very altruistic if you think about what people are doing here and what they like to do in the future. And I'm just so pleased that we can provide them with this opportunity here at Oxleas.
So I think it's a very inspirational event. Key learning for us was that we have a lot of skills through Involve about supporting service users on that journey. And actually, the key bit was also supporting staff who are just so time poor, but very willing. So just having somebody who could just make that bridge, like a community bridge builder, but it's almost a bridge back into our staff teams. And probably when you looked around the film, you recognize a lot of staff in a lot of different areas. It gives you some idea of the spread. So I'll leave it there for comments.
Thank you, Joe, and then Abby, and then.
Just going to say, I mean, where Involve has got to, I know there's more to go, and I think you've said sometimes progress is slow because this is really hard and difficult stuff. I think that is truly inspiring, both for what we're doing in terms of co-production, but for the people involved as well, and particularly if some of those are finding their ways into permanent roles within the trust as well. It's really, really good. So congratulations to the team.
Pass that on. Thank you.
suppose it's just going to be an echo of what Joe has said, and it was interesting looking at the film because I know some of the facilitators because they work within the quality team and the safety team, and they provide such a richness to the conversation and how you approach things and how you see things and it really defines what co-production is. So it's not about tokenism and the person just being there. It's about actually being involved. And the facilitators that work within the quality management team do extremely good work. And I saw one of them, and I know the day he started, he found it very difficult. So I'm surprised he was able to get up and speak. Because I know what his difficulties are and the fact that he's been able to come out of himself and be able to demonstrate what he can do and that we're helping to facilitate and support that. But the flip side is how it then engenders kindness in our own staff when you start to work with people and you start to see that difference and don't see it as a barrier but as something that should be supported. And I think we should hold on to that and continue to reinforce that.
Sophie, and then Nisa. Could have done the other way around, but
yeah, just to echo all of that as well. And I think it's really important that what this work shows is that non-tokenistic and not putting people with lived experience in a box over there, but actually bringing them, connecting people into this organisation. The second point is that it's not just through volunteering that people's experience has to be valued and given a monetary value, and they're given paid roles. And I think that's absolutely wonderful to see. And hopefully this funding can continue and we can continue to grow those roles. And just the third point was about carers who are referenced there. And this comes back to the triangle of care as well. We saw that the support was really, really important. So we talk about involving carers. How do we support carers to be involved? And having that peer engagement is absolutely critical in that. So I think there's real benefits that come through in so many different ways.
Thank you. Yeah, echoing all of that, great presentation. But to Abby's, building on Abby's point, we talked earlier about, you know, how to create an environment where staff have the freedom to care and give them the opportunity to do that. And one of the benefits of this is just you are strengthening that muscle, right? Because they have the opportunity to do it, while in some of their kind of core patient interactions, they don't necessarily have the time or the ability or even see through the benefits coming through. So it's a great kind of initiative from that aspect as well.
Jim.
Just a quick question. What's the longevity of a PEF within the programme? And what happens to them afterwards?
So it's a 2-year programme. The aim is once that ends that we try and look for employment. So sometimes they get employed outside because a lot of transferable skills, or they do what they're talking about in the film. They get employed in the trust, which is exceeded our expectations. So that's sort of what next. And then of course you have the next cohort coming through.
Could you give us an idea of two questions? Could you give us an idea roughly of how many we have employed within the trust? That would be interesting. And I'm also interested in a really strong programme, but I'm interested in the gender split as well, because the film looked a somewhat biased gender split, which might be fine, but just your comments on that. Thank you.
So I don't have the exact figures, but I can find them. So we've had about 40 people on the programme, and I would think it would be about 5 to 10 so far. But it would be much better if I checked my rather than put my finger in the wind. Actually, we're doing some work on the representation. What's the demographics here? It's looking very balanced across all the protected characteristics. So I think it probably was an artifact of the film, really, that it looks that way.
Thank you. Any more comments? Well, I think you've got a very strong sense from this group of how supportive it is and how this is an initiative. The money is for how long do we have the money for at the moment?
Well, NHS England, so they give us a 2-year cycle. We don't know how long that goes on for, which is why we're hoping it will continue.
So again, making sure we measure the benefits so that we can, one, as you've already done, get the renewal of the funding, and two, work out how to fund it otherwise. Okay, thank you very much, Neil, and thank you for that presentation. Trying to recreate where we are on the agenda. I think we're at the chair's report now. I haven't got a lot to say over and above what Iffy's already said in his chief executive, except I would like to not acknowledge those Oxleas Recognition Awards that are coming up. I think that's really important. I think we talked a lot about the budget already, but there's various straws going out about how that's going to play out. But I think we've heard that one. I think that one of the things that I've been involved in doing, and Rachel C's help has been key in this as well, is thinking through how we are going to have meetings that take some of that ideas that we have, the innovation that we have, and think through how are we going to develop a culture where that is more widespread, because we do absolutely excellent innovation in places, but how do we make it more widespread? How do we use that to really address the challenges? And tied into that, I've been speaking to Graham Lord at the new Vice President at King's College around who's also the Chief Executive as well of King's Health Partners, about how we could interact more closely with them, their ongoing discussions. Yeah, we need to have some internal discussions as well. I think the other thing that's worth talking about as well, and if he mentioned it in briefly in passing in his talk, but I think we are beginning to have talks now with the ICB around ways in which we can be strategic. If he mentioned neighbourhood groups in Bexley, there's also going to be discussions around this site and how we can make best use of this site. But it seems that the ICB is beginning now to think spend some of its time, certainly since when I started, when I arrived, it was all focused on the money. Maybe it's the time of year that they are beginning to be thinking more, and that has its challenges, but I think it has immense opportunities for us as well. The other things to say that I've been involved in a lot is the appointment of NEDs. We benefit from Damien's presence here. We have appointed another NED, but the process is still ongoing, so we can't mention names at the moment, but hopefully we will have in the new year, we will have a really strong candidate who will be able to join us on the board. Anything else I should be saying that people are aware of? Any questions for me? I feel like chairing myself, but you are free to ask me questions. Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on. And just to, before we go on to the operational report, I just want to say that my plan is, if it's arrived, that's the only trouble with this seat is you never quite know I hear sounds behind me and I never quite know what those sounds are. But if lunch has arrived, I'm going to suggest we break at 12:30 for lunch, because that will probably be about the time. So just to allow you to psychosomatically control your blood glucose levels for the next 25 minutes. And we'll break for lunch then. Operational report, Lorraine.
Thank you. So there's just two things today that Ian wanted to highlight from his report. The first relates to the National Mental Health Assertive Outreach return. So people will remember that when we were last here in September, we were just in the process of preparing our response to the ICB for the NHS England return. That was submitted on the 20th of September. In terms of one of the key elements of that, we had to identify the number of patients we thought we had in the organisation that met with their criteria. And for us, that was 350 out of a total psychosis caseload of just over or just under 3,000. And we used quite supportive, I hope, means to ascertain from staff what they wanted us to be saying in that return. So we had a listening event and a number of focus groups. We've produced an action plan. It has some quick win actions, so things that we can be getting on with that staff will find supportive. So an example of that is that we recognised that staff have a range of different policies that contain information relevant to a particular theme and don't always have the time to be grappling with that. So pulling together some one-page summaries that pull the salient points out of those different policy documents was thought to be just a very quick, helpful thing for staff. We've been drawing on the experience of EIP, where actually we found really high levels of assurance and what we can learn from those to support other teams. And we've also been asked by the ICB what it would take to close the gap. So we've recently submitted a plan for what funding would be required in order for us to work differently. And we're just waiting on the outcome of whether or not we will see some new money. But if we do, we have some clear plans. We met with NHS England probably about 3 weeks ago now, and the early indications from that work, from their perspective, are a need to develop some core standards for community mental health services, and we should see those implemented from next spring. And so they're hoping to get us an early draft at Christmas so that we can provide feedback on those. And we also understand that following their meeting with the CQC, there will be a targeted inspection using a methodology from Nottinghamshire, looking at psychosis services. So we would anticipate probably next year we will be on the list for that inspection. The second thing to update on is the South East London Children and Young People's Neurodevelopmental Transformation Programme. And that's been working to optimise how children and young people receive their diagnosis. It's had a number of different work streams through a task and finish group, mapped current pathways. And I think really helpfully, NHS England last year stood up a clinical reference group, and they've just released the first outputs of that group, which chime very well with the South East London work. So there's no additional asks within that. So the three key elements are having a single front door, that services need to be needs-led, and that diagnosis should really only be seen as one part of accessing support when you've got a child or a young person thought to have needs in that area. And so that's probably all I wanted to say. There's obviously the directorate updates in the pack, but if there's any questions.
Questions or comments for Lorraine? Jim.
Thanks, Lorraine. First question, I didn't quite understand the term depot medication and how that links to discharge.
Yeah, so we have a number of, quite a high number of patients who have injectable medication to treat their psychosis, and they're really tricky to discharge to primary care. So primary care have always been quite reluctant to take patients on that medication back, partly for a number of reasons, partly because it worries them, they're not confident, partly because they don't know what to do if somebody doesn't attend for the appointment, and what the kind of time that they can leave that for is. But we are doing some really good work. Kemi's been leading a piece of work in Bromley, and it's really small numbers, but we are slowly beginning to see some positive kind of outputs of that work and some patients that have successfully been transferred back to primary care. So the hope is that we can build on that success and get some better traction with primary care.
Thanks, Lorraine. So on assertive outreach, I understand, or I seem to recall hearing that we had assertive outreach previously and then we stopped doing that. So it would be helpful to know kind of why that occurred and if there are any lessons from that we're sort of taking forward now and we're kind of thinking about it. And then second, so I can understand the position we're in. We've asked for more money to help fund some of these kind of assertive outreach. We don't know if we'll get it. What is the kind of, would we have to do it anyway, basically, is what I'm trying to do, or is it funding dependent?
So we did have assertive outreach teams, and I think if you spoke to some of the clinicians that worked in those teams, they would say that the outcomes for those patients were not that different to the outcomes we get for patients within our current model. So when we restructured community mental health services back in 2017, we have something called ICMP, which is intensive case management for psychosis, and that's taking some of those principles of assertive outreach, but working with a much broader group of people to try and kind of level up, really, in the same way that we've, there's a national direction with care coordination, because you want best bits of what you can offer to be available to as many people as need it. So we aren't particularly advocating to bring back assertive outreach. We think there are other ways that you can achieve those outcomes for patients without needing to structure teams in that way. And one of the key elements for us of that has been the introduction of care teams approach. So just wrapping more support around an individual, increasing face-to-face contacts, because that's some of the learning from assertive outreach. So they were a team that just had a bit more capacity to really kind of target more time and energy into individual patients. We think we can achieve that through care teams approach. The question about whether it's funding dependent is really interesting, because I think there are definitely things that we can do that don't require money, and there are definite productivity gains that can be made along that pathway. But we do have some significant challenges in terms of that depot medication issue and also caseload sizes. So the caseload sizes are huge. That is driven partly by the depot issue, so they are very linked. And we won't solve all of that without some additional funding or without a change in practice between primary care and secondary care. So we've modelled what it would take to reduce caseload sizes, and that's part of the ask. But there are definitely things that can be done without the funding.
Abby and then Jo.
Thanks. Just to build on what Lorraine was saying, caseload sizes are particularly important because, as she said when she was presenting the paper, in our early intervention teams who have a specific caseload of between 19 and 20, you can sort of wrap around the care much easily. And I think the standards that are going to be produced around community mental health will be interesting, because nobody has actually said what is the ideal caseload and case mix for community mental health. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But there's also something about what we had said earlier about the social determinants as well. So housing, education, employment, because I think some things that people don't tend to remember is early intervention does a lot around education and occupation, as do our community rehab teams as well. So I think those are the kind of lessons we learned. And if I remember, because I've worked in assertive outreach team, you have novel things like music groups and bands and things that you use to engage people, which are out of what you would do within a service, but you do have to be really creative around engaging some people.
It's just a question, and this may be more Jane rather than you, Lorraine, about our new sickle cell nurse. And I wondered, I thought that sounded very positive, but I wondered what her role was. Would she be working within other services or what?
I have to be honest, I actually haven't seen the specification for the role, so I'm going to be honest there. But previously we did have a really good sickle cell service, and it was nurse-led, and it was nurse-led for years, and it reached into the acute services, worked very closely with them, and people dealing with genomics as well. So it was sort of through the lifespan, and it very much worked with the local population, community groups in a much wider remit than just the sort of
clinical support to people. But with sickle cell, when people go into sickle cell crisis, it is a really, really excruciating condition. People need really, really swift acute management, and anything that will help that and prevent admissions and make sure that people get that treatment really quickly is always welcome. So that's kind of the end goal, I think. But Lorraine may know more about it.
No more than you've said, Jane. So I'm grateful for what you have said.
Okay, so maybe we need to touch, feed some information back would be helpful on that one. But thank you. I think it sounds a very good initiative, and good to see the link through to GSTT, because they've got immense clinical strengths and research strengths in this area as well, which is good. Lorraine, can I just ask you one question about the assertive outreach centre? Because in a way what we're doing here as well is there's an element of risk management here, but it's a very low frequency risk, and therefore we won't see. So how will we know whether what we're doing is having the benefit? What are the lead indicators that we could use in order to tell whether what we're doing is the right thing and our interventions are having an effect?
Interesting, that was one of the conversations when we met with the London group a few weeks ago, and I think it's all the things around that. So in terms of whether you can ever prevent a really serious incident, that's very hard to ever measure. But what we can look at is whether or not we're achieving good medication compliance with somebody, that we're able to do the kind of education and support to enable them to understand. Psychosis is a relapsing condition. It takes quite some time for people to develop insight. And so it's quite hard in those initial periods to get them to be compliant with medication. They sometimes take medication, feel better, think they can stop. And so that's often a really good indication if we can get really good compliance with medication. But I think the other really big thing for us will be family engagement. So whether or not staff have really got the confidence and the skills to work with people's support network and not just the individual, because often people don't engage brilliantly and it's easy to then say, not engaged. And I think this was the worry in Nottinghamshire, that, what do you then do? So it's about how you then work through other people to achieve some of those outcomes. And we've got some ways that we can measure that in terms of what people, the forms and the recording that they do in Rio. So we'll be looking at care planning, medication compliance, family engagement, and then I think some broader staff and patient experience measures.
Thank you, Anita, and then we'll move on.
Just going back to our discussion earlier in the morning when we talked about when we were talking about prevention, one of the examples that sort of came up is, well, it's great to have that, but then when you start measuring it, it actually adds a lot of admin burden. And I think there was someone in our group who, said just get chills thinking about it, because it's going to be another form. And this is one of the challenges that we have for our staff. We can't create a culture of care because we have so much admin. And I hear this discussion, and I don't mean to suggest that that's what you're proposing, but this is one of those from the discussion where it would really hit the road, because actually it's very hard to measure. So you might spend a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to measure, evaluate something, and that may have a benefit because it is good to know what those benefits are, but there's a cost, and we should be mindful that actually if the outcome is to disengage staff and so on, that's actually quite a significant cost, and we can weigh that against the benefit of having measurements. And I think examples like this, where it's really difficult to measure, really brings that home.
I think that's going to be potentially something, depending on the core standards, that we really push back on, because we want the core standards to reflect the need to care and that people need contact. That often some of the best ways of engaging this group is just, lots of contact and lots of normal conversation often, but not through lots of form filling, box ticking, kind of new audits and tools. And so we want the standards to be meaningful, but we need them to be proportionate in terms of what they add on to people's task list, so that actually they recognise that the key driver needs to be people need to care. We need to free up people to do the contact.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Lorraine, for the whole report. Okay, we're now on board visits report, and we've got about 15 of them. We've had a very productive time there, and Manisa, you seem to have done about half of them as well. Looking forward to these ones, but again, of course, everybody understands that everyone's read the papers, so please bring out highlights and things that you really want us to note, rather than that. Otherwise, your blood glucose levels might drop. But Manisa, you're going to start first. You've got Bromley and Greenwich West's ICMP.
Sure, I'll go through all of them if that's okay. I think.
Yeah. Okay, all of your ones, fine. Great.
I'll take the papers as read, so I won't go into them. I'll just highlight a few. One of we had a great visit at Bexley Memory Service. One of the things that stayed with me, which might not be a surprise for the clinicians, but was for me, was the impact they're seeing post-COVID, because there's apparently data that shows now that post-COVID, post-infection, you have early onset of Alzheimer's and dementia. So they're seeing a lot of patients in their 40s, 50s, and it's sort of unusual. And that, it was just a reminder as to how the NHS, and we need to be vocal about this, is still seeing these effects. And as COVID is more endemic, the knock-on impacts to that. Other than that, great visit and great team. Greenwich West ICMP. So sometimes, in these visits, teams really look to showcase and try very hard to be positive. I think Greenwich West was a team which were quite candid with their frustrations, and appreciate the candor, because it kind of came across. And I really thought about it as Lorraine was talking about assertive outreach, because all of these points about the burden, the caseload, and this feeling that nothing is sort of good enough kind of came through. And I know, Lorraine, there's work being done to address in particular their concerns around security, but a lot of the challenges that they raised are ones that don't really have easy solutions, right? It's not that we're not listening, it's just we don't really know how to address them, because they're significant problems. And, when we talk about things like assertive outreach, and you have these teams that feel already really strained, just anything that adds to that makes me nervous. And then the last one I would sort of draw out is Bromley EIP, because that was, it was a really positive visit. I think Iffy, who's not here, but at the time he was talking about what we could take from this to be as an example of the best model of care, because the team, great morale. You really felt like they had that, that space to engage and care, but they had a very manageable workload. They had the ability to really invest a lot in patients. So I think replicating it would be very challenging. I don't know, Lorraine, if you want to comment, because I think there has some work being done on the gap between what it would take to sort of replicate that across teams. But this wasn't something that necessarily came across, but it's also, because it is early intervention, they brought out a lot of examples of patients who'd gotten better. There's a lot of hope and optimism in that team. And that's a sort of intangible benefit, which I think keeps morale up high. And, I think that's one of the other things that we can reflect on. Like, prevention can be very positive work for staff, right? It can be so I don't know if that would be easier to staff or easier to kind of support. So just like that, I was prepared for something quite different, because obviously we're very focused in Nottingham, and the Baldur Colkane was an EIP patient, but the team was very positive and confident about their work. So that was great to hear, and happy to take any questions.
Joe, and then Abby.
Just struck, and I get it, the comment you made that staff sometimes feel that what they do is never good enough, or is never seen as good enough. And I wonder if there is more we can do to highlight good practice and good examples, because particularly, if you take the various incidents that make it to the press, it's such a negative stance, and we know things can always be better and different, but that would, it weighs on me, and I'm not involved, so it must weigh very heavily on staff who are involved. So I wonder if there is more we can do to talk about good practice and good examples and sharing to try and sort of boost the other side of the scale.
Then Lorraine. Oh, Lorraine on this one, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to say that it is it's fascinating what staff kind of take from certain messages. So when we met with them, what they heard from the Veldo-Callicane report was that staff in Nottinghamshire had been accused of having blood on their hands, and that was a kind of one line in a report in a kind of the media, but that was what was most pressing in their minds. And I think they asked us, well, what even if we provided absolutely top level care, what if that still happened? And that's a real dilemma, isn't it? Because we can't be seen to be complacent and say you can never, you can't ever prevent these things, but at the same time need to help staff reconcile the fact that sometimes even when you do a really good job, it doesn't necessarily result in the best outcome. And we're kind of thinking about how we can do some of that work with staff, but it's tough and it's quite emotionally draining work for people.
Thanks, Moniza. And it was your comment about the Bromley EIP and how motivated and engaged the team was. And I think that's something we recognise in the so-called glamorous teams, so early intervention, perinatal, rehab teams. And I think that's what we want to get in the other teams that we have within community mental health, so that people don't sort of feedback that all the things we do, nothing. So it's just for those staff to feel as motivated and to enjoy what they do. I think that's where we need to get to for all of our teams, for people to enjoy what they do.
Thank you. I'll pass to, thank you, and Rachel for Plumstead District Nurses.
Thanks very much. If it's okay, Andrew, I'll talk both about Plumstead District Nurses on page 73 and Woolwich District Nurses, which are on page 93, because you'd have read the papers and the themes relate to both, if that's okay. So what really struck me from both teams is what kind of a committed, lovely, kind of warm, supportive team dynamic there was. But what also hit me was the sheer logistics of what they do makes their jobs exceptionally difficult. So the sorts of things that might be frustrating to us in terms of kind of roadworks or parking problems, because of the nature of what they do day in, day out, it really, really impacts their ability to be able to see the number of people they want to be able to see and to be able to do it effectively. And so you'll see in the report that it's a lot of detail about the niggles, the sorts of things that get in the way for them. But that is really important because it really affects their productivity. It really affects their morale. And, they're very conscious things like if one part of a local GP service, which continues to be registered locally to them, moves quite much further away, then all of those patients they have to then kind of see further away, and that can have massive impacts for them. So those small sorts of differences really, really make a difference to the quality of care that they can provide. So that kind of really stuck with me as having gone there. The other was around the fact that they continue to be referred from GPs and from care homes, quite low level things that really isn't the best use of their time, and we've been thinking about how to push back. But probably in light of the fact of how many difficult things they have to challenge each day, I just really wanted to call out the work that Rachel Matheson does, because in both visits, there was this range of really tricky issues. On each one that they raised, she had already been thinking of really creative things that she could be doing to try and fix it. Most of them where they related to the people strategy, for example, to the people directorate, for example, she had already raised with me. And I was just really impressed with the seriousness with which she was already responding to their feedback and taking all of that forward. And I just thought that was worth mentioning.
Can I just ask about this one? Because these little niggly things that get raised, it's great that we've been able to pick them up and we've been able to respond to them. How do we deal with that in day-to-day life without there being a board visit?
So I think the fact that Rachel, for example, there as a service manager already knows about them, is already progressing them, and they were often saying, as we've already spoken to Rachel about. So I didn't feel as though there was this whole thing that they were holding back until a board visit came. They were repeating things that they had said before. And some of these are things we can't easily fix. You know, Greenwich parking is things we can continue to have discussions around, but it's not easy to get the local authority to approach things differently for good reason. So yeah, I didn't feel as though it was dependent on the board visit.
Thank you. That's reassuring. Okay, the next one I have on my list is Helix, which Lorraine, in Effie's absence.
Yes, I think other than what you'll have read in the paper, the only thing to probably pull out, I'm sure people will have picked up from the report that the team closed to referrals for a short period over the summer. And we talked a lot with them about that because that was something that they felt really uncomfortable about. But they had some really good, robust plans in place. They'd worked very carefully with midwifery services to ensure that there was still an offer for the women that wouldn't then be referred to Helix. And they very quickly in September did reopen their wait list after making some tweaks to their model and doing some recruitment. So they are a really niche service. It's very small. It's a purely psychological service. And they have just, you know, when we were listening to them present some of the examples of work that they've done, they get really great outcomes for some very vulnerable women. But they have seen demand that was, you know, incredibly high and well in excess of the anticipated demand when the service was set up. So as you'll see in the report, 51 referrals was the sort of planned anticipated demand. It had 151, I think, in 11 months. So significantly outweighing what they were designed to cope. But in the circumstance, done a brilliant job. They were very passionate about what they do. We've got some good links to our perinatal service, so it was on the whole a really positive visit.
Jim.
Thanks, Lorraine. My question was about the demand, because it's quite interesting that the demand's 3 times what we predicted. So either we didn't predict that well, or there's something we didn't know about. That was the unmet need there. If there's unmet need there, is this not a case for maybe us to look at this and maybe invest more? Because if they're coming up organically, there's obviously an unmet need there. And the other question is really about the ethnicity of the women that are coming forward. Do we capture that information? Because if it is down to, let's say, deterioration of maternity care, that might have an equity and inequality sort of angle to it.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. They are doing some work on health inequalities because they have recognised that there is definitely some kind of demographic sort of links in that demand. The demand projection was a national piece of work, and I think it's one of those things. These services didn't exist at all before maternal mental health services were stood up. So you don't always know the demand until you've got something there and people come. So I think a victim of their own success in that sense. But also it coincided with the publication and a massive amount of media interest in the poor maternity outcomes in a lot of maternity services across the country, which seemed to drive up demand. So lots of women that perhaps started to question whether their experience had been right or not, that perhaps previously, without the context of some of those reports and the media attention, might have accepted what was a poor experience and a poor outcome. And this service is for people without pre-existing mental health conditions, so it's purely for women who have had a traumatic experience during birth. So it's a very particular pathway.
Thank you. Nina, Greenwich Single Point of Access.
Thank you. This was a really interesting visit because this service is the engine room, if you like, for 10 services that we provide in Greenwich. One of the things that really stood out was the sense of purpose, the commitment. One of the team leads said to us, and she had joined us from Greenwich Council, I had to leave my previous role because I couldn't sleep at night. I didn't feel as if I was actually helping people. Here, I feel like I'm actually doing something that means that is actually having an impact. In terms of the concerns that were raised, there are a number of aggressive calls from parents whose children have been on waiting lists for ASD and ADHD assessments for a very long time. It was interesting to note that this has increased the incidence of these has increased. And one of the possible reasons is we used to provide resources for parents who are on the waiting list, and this seems to have slipped away. So there are attempts to try and understand why that is and whether we can reinstate. The original provider of that service no longer provides it. So I think they're trying to find an alternative. When I walked into the office, and it was a very busy office, I don't know, Abby, whether you got the same sense. It felt as if I was walking into a kind of setup that was more familiar with the 1990s in terms of what we had as IT equipment and telephony equipment. And there was a real sense that the equipment and the technology hampers the ability of colleagues to be able to do what is actually quite an intensive role. So what you said earlier, Alison, about making sure that digital is involved and technology is involved from the outset, I do wonder whether there is a broader piece of work that we might be able to look at in terms of some of the estate. Something that is, I hope, a little bit more achievable in the short term, and I know that we've done this in forensics. I think a number of colleagues mentioned that band 2, they are at the band 2 level, but band 2 doesn't seem to be an appropriate level given the complexity and the variety of services that they're providing to support the 10 teams that they support across Greenwich. They had, I think, a level of about 30% turnover. And so it felt as if they were on a kind of constant treadmill of training. So they wanted us to explore whether band 3 was a more viable entry level. And I know we have done something like that in forensics. I wonder if there's possibility to look at that here.
Thank you. Can I see some actions taking forward? Abby, do you want anything more, or are you happy? Or
that's been left with Lisa, the service director, and Sabitha to look at. And we have said maybe the first step is looking at whether it's been appropriately banded through the Agenda for Change panel. So they will do that.
Thank you. Alison.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. It'd be good to have a follow-up conversation about your observations about the technology there. And I think they've got access to some quite innovative technology in terms of being able to use phone systems from home, etc. So it'd be good to just see whether or not they're actually using that, or whether or not there's more that we need to do. So it'd be great to follow up.
I think issues with some of their desktops, and
yes,
it was a case of log your call, and if you can't get a response, then we'll see what the admin manager will see what she can do. So we have asked them to do that.
And also, Alison, very happy to chat offline. But we stood with colleagues as they were kind of showing us how they have to jump from one system to another just to log one call, and it was really quite striking the amount of time that takes.
Okay, so let's move some offline. Perhaps an offline discussion would be helpful. As for Lorraine, the Bexley and Bromley Community Learning Disability Team. In stereo.
Devices now. I was going to take both this one that's on page 82, then the finance one because Steve's not here, and page 99, which is the Bromley Cymru's, if I can. So, if I could just take there are similarities, I am going to say, between the Bexley and Bromley Community Learning Disability teams and the Bromley Cymres. Similar themes to what we've just said. It's that differential between having a smaller caseload and then being able to give a much more nuanced, person-centric service that absolutely meets the needs of those patients. So in both of those services, we saw really good evidence of people really getting to understand what those service users required in order to get the best out of that service. Very, very engaged staff that were very motivated by the fact that they could see that journey over a longer period of time. An excellent example, I would say, that came out actually from Bexley, but I'm sure would be replicated in Bromley, from the epilepsy service and the real difference that they had made to a patient and their family over that period of time, which was really inspiring. And then the last one, probably on the Bromley Cymres, in terms of my reflections on that, was there was a couple of themes that were coming out in terms of things that could change. So we had an extended discussion about the use of Section 2 and Section 3, coming back to the conversation that we've just had about Valdo Calcaine. It was that ability for, if individuals are not compliant with their drug regime, the fact that they can think they're getting better, but they're not getting better, and then they go back into having quite a bad crisis moment, and the implications that that can have, and a little bit about the revolving door of those individuals being readmitted time and time again when they get to that crisis point. So there was, I think there's something that we were going to be exploring, and Lorraine had said that she was going to raise it, with how that works across community and the acute and crisis team. It's probably the main one I wanted to bring out there. There was also, and I feel slightly embarrassed presenting this one, Steve did a visit to finance that he did say was the best, but he's done a number of them over his tenure, and he said this was the best one that he'd ever attended. What was nice was we took a theme of 6 individuals, 5 of whom have joined the trust in the last 6 months, and I'm just going to say I think this is it really calls out how well some of that onboarding is now working, and I'm going to give the benefit of that to my HR colleagues. Some of the little touches about being able to send, they get an individual message onto the LinkedIn saying welcome, and that really landed incredibly well with the group of young people that had effectively came in, because they said it set a tone within the organisation. And the real theme that they felt was the experience that they had coming into the finance department at Oxleas was markedly different from the experience that they had had elsewhere. So I just thought I would call that out. I'm hoping that is replicated across a range of our new starters in the trust.
So thank you. Good. Myself and Alison went to HMP, Stanford Hill, Swailside and Elmley. My learning from it was actually you've got 3 prisons next door to each other, but very different tensions, pressures, issues, even though they're on it. My other learning is slightly on side, which the Isle of Sheppey is a different place, which I hadn't realised before, but that's my ignorance, nothing else. And I think that what was interesting there were some issues around agency staff pay, which is being taken forward in terms of trying to understand really whether we can persuade more people to move away from agency onto other ones, because there's a lot of also competition between those 3 prisons for staff, which is sucking things away. And then also thinking imaginative about the lack of psychology resources, and Alison got into a conversation about whether some of the psychology, they were very short of psychology on the island, and whether this could be sourced remotely using MS Teams. And I think that was an example of actually people being able to use a visit like this to stand a little bit away and saying, oh yes, that's a possibility. I don't know if it's going to work out or not, but it was something that we've heard since that they have picked this up and are exploring this as ability of getting remote psychology services in as well as inline. Anything else you want to say, Alice? No. Thank you. Joe for Mariposa House.
Yes, so great visit Jane and I did to Mariposa House. So that is this step down hostel on Goldie Lee that's managed with by the Langley Trust, and pretty seamless involvement of our clinicians, and very seamless involvement of so from the wards when someone is identified as to be potentially going to be able to go to the hostel, so you get continuity of clinician through there. Just really positive. I mean, these ladies have generally been in services for a very long time, and they are managing, as you see there, the average length of stay is about 2 years. It varies a lot, but they are managing. It's very difficult to then find placements for people afterwards, very positive thing. When Jane and I have done visits to the Bracton, and I recently did a visit to Joydens, which I need to write up, they were also very positive. Mariposa comes out as a sort of beacon of a great place for people. People want to go there, and it helps their journey through the Bracton because they think they can get there. So whether we need more places like this, I don't know. It's very interesting. As you can see in the actions, they have a couple of other rooms. So Langley Trust were keen to see if there was find a way of they can use that, because that then gives them more flexibility. People come on leave and stay for periods. But great example of partnership work. Really, really good. And I think a really positive example of what the SLP can do, because that was something that came out of the SLP.
Thank you. Good news there. Abby, I think this is the last one. Greenwich Community Peds, if I've got it right. Oh, yes.
Thank you. So I visited the community paediatrics team at Greenwich on the 25th of September with Lisa and Sabitha, and the team were very pleased to tell us about their response to treatment time and how that had improved, because they thought they were worse than Bexley, but when the data was split, they found out they were doing quite well. So they were quite pleased to tell us that, but they were pleased about it more from the patient point of view and the fact that they were managing to deliver interventions. They do a lot, which is all listed out in the paper, and they did talk about the demand, especially for the statutory reports, which needed to be done within a certain time frame. And it's interesting that my previous visit had been to the single point of access, and they were also speaking about how their reports were not being typed as quickly as they should, and some of it is due to the turnover within the SBA. So it was something that Lisa was going to look into. We met with other members of staff. 2 of them were international medical graduates who had just started with the team and were quite positive about their experience and how they had been supported and were able to navigate the system. They all knew about Freedom to Speak Up Guardian. They had community paediatrics is a difficult area to recruit to, and they had 3 consultants retire in the last few years. They've been able to recruit 2. One just started and another is starting in January, and one of our SAS, which is a middle grade doctor, they've supported her to get onto the specialist register, so that's been really good. So they've managed their vacancies in that way, but really good team. And yeah, nothing else, and they didn't talk about parking actually. In fact, the SBR in the team said that's the first place she's been able to park when she started.
Thanks, Abby. Just a quick, the change the gender pathway. What's the feedback on that?
They didn't feel that they would be impacted. They haven't seen anything yet. They just said it will be part of what their normal routine will be. That patients get referred to them and they would see them. So they haven't seen any impact yet, but we did ask that question.
And just, I'm surprised Alison hasn't put her hand up, but when we talk about the backlog of reports and the time taken, it just screams technology. And so, maybe that's a good area for us to pilot one of the new technologies, because that would be transformative, I think.
Yeah, they have put themselves forward for ambient, as has every other team in the trust, but we shall, we'll see.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether you can replace the chair with ambient. Thank you, everyone. I suggest we break for lunch now. Now, it's that was 10 to. Would people want to end lunch at past? Would that be a good time, or would people like a shorter lunch and end earlier? Shorter. So shall we end at, would 15:15 be okay? Is that right? So we'll start again at 15:15 and steal 15:15 from somewhere. Thank you for part 2 of part 1 of the meeting. And we'll go straight into the mortality surveillance report. Jane.
Thank you very much. The mortality surveillance report is on page 104 of the bundle, and this report has already been reviewed by the Executive Committee and the Quality Committee, so it's really coming here just so that the broader board can see it. I just wanted to highlight one part of the report really, and that was the fabulous review that the prison services have done into deaths following people during the early days of discharge from hospital. There isn't a lot of information out there. There's a couple of national reports, and there's I think you yourself provided an international study which was very helpful and also resonated with the results. But there's probably no surprises in them, but it was helpful for us to look at this. And just a couple of really interesting areas. For us, it was HMP Elmley and HMP Channings Wood that experienced the post-release deaths. The numbers are very small, so I'm not sure that we can really extrapolate a lot from that. In line with other findings, it was the first 14 days that were the highest risk of death. And for us, this was on a Monday. And these were young people, males aged between sort of 26 and 23. Usually it was from unnatural causes. And there was also, these people were taking medications for physical health purposes. Just a couple of things to highlight was patients were engaging in prisons, particularly for mental health and substance misuse, posed the greatest risk compared to those who did not engage with the services. And all of the offender healthcare teams are really working closely to ensure that the patients leaving custody are offered medical discharge letters to support the continuation of their care and support that they might need early discharge. That was really the key thing I just wanted to highlight here.
Thank you, Jane. Just one question on that one, if I may. Really good we've done this survey, and really useful data. Might be useful data for other people doing similar services in other prisons. How does this get? Is there a network that we can disseminate this across all prison healthcare services?
The head of healthcare, Annie Dale, in the Southwest, has shared it with the national lead at the Royal College of Nursing for offender healthcare. It's being taken forward through that route to be shared, and there's other similar forums that they're networking with.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jane. Just a quick question about the early release scheme. How is that affecting our staff, and have we sort of considered the impact of that on the health of the prisoners who've been released?
Yeah, they are actively looking at that. I think there's only been one death in the last few weeks. So it's still very early days, but it has created a lot of work for people.
Thank you. Any other questions? Can I ask about the letter of review of AA? What I where the care was excellent, was defined as excellent, very happy with it. Just for my information, how would her journey likely have been different if she hadn't had learning difficulties? What would you imagine? Obviously, it's our position. But.
This is a really good question and something we reflect on a lot at the Mortality Surveillance Committee and when we receive the leader reviews. Essentially, it's the access to the screening initially and picking up signs of cancer and other diseases very early on and making sure that she would have access to the treatment in an equitable way. I think what you have picked up on that there was very compassionate and supportive care of this lady in this case. And although she wasn't open to the community learning disabilities team, she was seen regularly by the speech and language therapist and a community nurse visiting the residential setting. And there was no criticism of them. There may just have been opportunities for them to explore whether additional support could have been given. But we often see delays in picking things up compared to people who may not have learning disabilities.
Do you think if she hadn't had learning difficulties, it probably would have been picked up either by herself or the system sooner?
Potentially.
Yeah.
I mean, she presented a very complex picture, and the way it was picked up was quite late. We do often see leader reports where things are picked up very late or screening hasn't happened.
Okay, thank you very much for that report. Very important report to receive. We now go to the Quality Committee report, and Sophie, you're kind enough to stand in for Suzanne on this.
Yes, I will, and I will ask for colleagues to comment and to help if needed. So the first thing is to alert the board to the HMP Rochester CQC inspection. As you can see, we received an urgent notification. The report says we will be receiving 4 regulatory notices for breaches. We've received those 4 notices. They are for medicines management, regarding our risk register, on complaints and on staffing levels. And Vicky very kindly talked me through what these mean. What it actually means is for medication management, HMP Rochester has 2 medication hatches to serve 750 men. So there are delays in getting medication and there are other issues associated with that. And we are working towards getting another hatch. And there's also an action plan that sits behind that. That really connects to staffing level as well, which was an issue with access to primary care. And again, the time taken in dispensing that medication does impact on how many people can see GPs. We are nearly fully established at that prison, but these are some of the pragmatic issues that get in the way of how their time is spent. But we've accepted those regulations and there is a comprehensive plan to address them. That also connects to the issue on complaints. Again, that's GPs not being responsive, but here it was also not being responsive in a compassionate way, which is something we are also addressing. And finally, around risk registers, what we have is each prison has a separate risk register, and each risk register lists every single risk at that prison. What we have found is many of those risks are shared across prisons. And so you have a very, very, very long list of risks to address, which isn't necessarily manageable. Vicky, I'm looking at you. Is that a correct summary? And Abby also. So yes, so there's a real need to reform those risk registers to work with local prisons and across prisons.
So it's about working with the staff to define what a risk is rather than issues that they may have that can be resolved within the service. And I think when we took over, I think people weren't sure, so they were just listing everything, but it's working with them on that.
So that was the alert around prisons. I'll go through and then take any questions if that's okay. We also I wanted to alert the board around the discussion we had about reducing the prone restraint risk. And just to assure you, there was a lot of consideration here. We particularly looked at the way this is now being measured through a health inequalities lens. So we're collecting demographics around people who experience prone restraint. So we felt with all of that, and after a discussion that came through the executive committee, and because CQC is going to be reporting on this in a new way, there's going to be a new process, those all fed into our recommendations around that. Again, I'm looking at colleagues to see if there's anything additional to add on that one. No. Okay, and yes, I should have said this is obviously for 2 meetings. This was for September and October, so that's why this is quite a lengthy report. I won't go through everything. I'll assume it's read. We had 2 great presentations. First one from Adult Learning Disability Directorate, really interesting, covered a lot of what we've discussed at today's meeting. A really, really excellently performing team. I think our reflections were the way in which physical health was addressed, in which their health inequalities were addressed, were particularly excellent. Looking at how Atlas House closure, again, has changed the way that this service is delivered, made it more community focused. I think the interesting discussion, there were many, but one of the most interesting discussions was around how we could really utilise this team's skill and understanding across the whole of Oxleas, because as we've seen again today, there's a real need for that understanding of how to treat learning disability and reduce those inequalities in places like acute and crisis wards, for example. So that's a small team, adult learning disability. How can we really make use of their skills without overstretching them? We from the Children and Young People's Directorate, again, covered a lot of the things that we have discussed today, particularly the gender referrals, the neurodiversity pathway, the demand, the waiting lists. We also looked at how teams could learn from each other. So Greenwich CAMS, I believe, is not doing so well. There's a issue with leadership. We talked about how they could work with Bexley, who are doing well, and learn from each other. Interesting in a national perspective, audiology services. There's national staffing shortages, so that's good to note. We saw a similar thing with speech and language before, so we're going to look at how that impacts overall. And we talked about the implementation of the Thrive model as well, which is something we've raised here today. And a key thing with both of those presentations, I think, was the underrepresentation of data. So we are now collecting health inequalities data as part of those presentations, which is brilliant. It really brings it to life. And as we've said in our strategy, we want it to cut across all directorates and not be hived out. However, it's not necessarily meaningful, maybe I sort of use that word in inverted commas, because we don't have enough data, because not enough people are giving us the demographic data. So we've all reflected on how that's the first step, and I know that's a key first stage in the plan, particularly for PCREF. How do we support people using our services, patients, carers, to give us their data and let them know why and how it can really, really help. So we also received 3 annual reports, which are attached in the reading room: the safeguarding reports, the patient experience reports, and the complaints reports, all of which we discussed and received assurance on. Again, happy to take any questions on that. You'll see the operations and the performance reports in there as well. That's also in the bundle. We discussed the exceptions. Again, medicines management, we had a particular conversation about lithium treatment review, and about where there was a 23% discontinuation rate. I know Abby will take questions on that if there are any, because I can't answer that particular area. And I believe as well, the final thing is to advise the committee on the Centre for Healthy Empowered Communities, with whom we're working, which will really take forward our work on health inequalities. Really interesting areas. They help to identify grants, which we then work with to bid for, and then we enter into research contracts with them. I think that's my understanding of the contractual relationship. And the areas that we're looking at are listed here. So I'll stop there, but if anyone's got anything to add or any questions, please.
Thank you, Sophie. Anything to add? Any questions or comments to that group? No. Thank you very much. Thank you. And we'll move on to business and infrastructure, Joe.
Yeah, happy to take the report as read. Just in the alert section, so the first item is I don't think quite right. So we did see the EY cyber assurance framework, which I referred to when we were talking about the cyber risk. The eagle-eyed amongst you would notice that isn't in part 2 of the board. We don't think it should be. It was given a good airing at Business and Infrastructure Committee. As I said, I think we so it was a preliminary report, and then the normal annual digital toolkit will effectively reflect that kind of assessment going forward. So we've got time to get our get in order ahead of that. So there were a number of areas where we feel that we are in a better position than the report suggested, but that we were being audited on something else at the same time. We hadn't got all the evidence available to prove the assertion. So we think we can do that. There are some areas where there are some easy things we need to do to improve our score. And I think there are areas where there are a bit bigger issues, which are probably sort of ICS wide, and we're looking at other solutions. I think it's a good development to move that toolkit towards cyber. And I'm sure if anyone has any particular questions on it, Alison can sort of provide the report and take you through it. Also in alert, we've talked about sustainability work. We've talked about that already, if you mentioned in his report. And really, it's worth noting the third item there. And again, that's been referred to, that whilst we are on track for our plan, subject to finding a way to bridge this gap on the pay review funding, the ICS is significantly off plan for some things we know about, like Synovis, and for the industrial action. But like us, other trusts are struggling on their SIPs and have less ability to cover that. So that is impacting on there. Other matters to mention, just to say, we did a regular deep dive into acute and crisis, which is significantly overspending, and so that was a very thorough analysis on that. We've got a couple of items coming in part 2 that we've around contracts that we have progressed with Chair's action, but we will endorse. And we had a couple of sort of benchmarking kind of reports where, whilst we know there are issues in data, the corporate benchmark report did flag some areas where we need to look perhaps in a bit more detail about what's going on and how we're benchmarking. So you can see there, particularly around HR costs, we're looking high on the benchmark. So it's good to start using some of that data. We submit an awful lot of data up. I think we noticed some areas where I think data quality could be improved. Likewise on the PLIX return, where for reasons not to do with us, they've sort of at the moment delayed the current year or the previous year's return. So the data we're looking at, it's not a typo, was 21-22. 22-23 has bin pulled. So we're saying, well, look, there's some good stuff in here. Let's get the latest version, which will come out in the spring for 23-24. So it's more current data. And then let's try and start use that in the work we're doing alongside the corporate benchmarking piece. PFI will pick up in part 2. Other than that, happy to take questions.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for that. And we will be picking up a lot of that in part 2 as well. Thank you. People Committee, Nina.
Thank you. There is nothing that People Committee wants to alert the board to on assurance, just to split that into people-related things versus health and safety. From a health and safety perspective, the board will recall that fire safety has been a real concern over a period of time, both in terms of the increase in the number of fires that we have had on wards, notwithstanding that they have been well managed, but also in terms of significant challenges that we have faced over a period of time in recruiting to fire safety roles. The good news is a fire safety advisor has now been appointed on a fixed term contract, and there is a programme of work underway as regards fire drills, as regards fire risk assessment reviews, and as regards fire alarm response training. So that is all in train and progressing well. We also received assurance from the health and safety team that they are working and have been providing support to the South West in relation to difficult issues as a result of Legionella and Radon. On the people side, and again from an assurance perspective, we received the gender pay gap and the race pay gap reports, which are in the bundle, and happy to take questions on. A very quick headline on both. From a gender pay gap perspective, the picture is a positive one, although there is still improvement to be made. The percentage gender pay gap difference as regards average pay has fallen from 10.6% in 23 to 9.4% in 24. And the disparity in clinical excellence awards, which we've discussed at various points around this table, has reduced to 12.3%. In relation to race, the report outlines a number of areas where we are continuing to do work, but the headline, and a lot of this work takes time to start to show up in results, but the headline is that over the last 2 years, there's been increased representation of BAME staff in all bands between 7 and 9 of over 30%, which I think is a phenomenal result. We heard from an advisory perspective, we would like to advise the board, as we've discussed earlier on in this meeting, that we agreed to close the risk 2424 in terms of industrial action, given the recent successful pay resolution. However, we are concerned about an uptick in terms of trends of medical workforce, and in particular a brain drain in forensics. So the medical workforce strategy is coming to the People Committee at our next meeting on the 20th of November. And we also noted that there has been a 20% reduction in applications for nursing courses. We also received the RES and the DES plans, which are also in the pack, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Nisa.
On the pay gap, so does this take into account like for like roles, or is this sort of in aggregate and is therefore a reflection of kind of the seniority of various genders or, you know, racial groups in the NHS, or is there a pay differential for kind of similar bands?
It's a good question, Munisa. Rachel, is that something that you?
So we're a bit different from many other organisations outside of the NHS. So the NHS is different from non-NHS organisations in terms of the fact that nearly all roles fall within the Agenda for Change structures, which imposes, and people often don't like this, quite rigid structures about what you can pay at particular levels with particular levels of experience. So to the extent that what the pay gap reporting is due to show is whether or not people with similar experience are being paid differently, that's pretty much dealt with by the Agenda for Change. But what it does show is overall, whether or not people overall, as you say, have been are whether men overall, for example, are being paid more than women, and whether they're progressing through our ranks as such more quickly. And what you do see is that there are many more men in senior roles proportionally to the number of men in the organisation as compared with women, and that's why you see some of that gap. So it's not about kind of equal pay for equal roles as much as representation at senior levels. Does that answer your question?
It does, yes. And that's why I was surprised that there was any pay gap if it was like for like.
Damien.
On people, I don't know if it's covered in the report, but as I'm sure you know, a couple of weeks ago, new legislation came into force on sexual harassment, which creates or puts significant requirements on organizations to demonstrate that they try to prevent it. Are we up to speed with that? And are we protected against potential negative implications of not being basically on track with that legislation? I'm thinking about the reputational risk as well as the risks, obviously, for the complainants themselves or the victims.
Yeah, and I don't know if Jane might want to come in on this as well, but as part of the violence and abuse meeting, we're now looking at sexual safety as well as part of that, because it makes sense. We've got the directorate leads in place. We've been awaiting the position and the guidance with quite a lot of bated breath, and we've now finally in a position to be able to take action and drive it forward. But Jane has been involved in all of this too.
Yeah, there have been quite a few webinars from NHS England over the past few weeks. They have given us template policies. There's some e-learning now available, and there's some assurance guidance that we can check ourselves against the charter as well. We are at the early stages of pulling that all together. It's literally only come out in the last week or so, and then we'll be engaging stakeholders and sharing communications more widely about that.
To answer both Damien and Muniza. So in addition to NHS England, the professional regulatory bodies have also been doing a lot of work around sexual misconduct and how to recognise it and how to act on it. So we included that in what we're doing with our professional groups as well. In the medical workforce, there has been disparity between the genders, mainly due to it being sometimes it was the female. So you could be at the same level consultant or other grade and have disparity due to various caring reasons, and also due to the clinical excellence awards, because females tended not to apply for it. But when we switched to using, during COVID, we switched the process of allocating clinical excellence awards, and that helped eliminate some of that gender disparity.
Thank you. I really welcome that. Just for the avoidance of doubt, obviously, as a new joiner, I have no specific concern for this organisation, but a number of organisations across industries have been in the past 5 to 10 years badly damaged by either poorly managed incidents or incidents that could have been prevented at some level. And I think it's hugely damaging to culture and reputation when it happens.
And Nina.
I was just I'm glad that you raised that, Damien. Thank you. I think we're in exactly the same position as what I'm seeing on a couple of other boards, which is responding to the stuff that has come out relatively recently. But there is a body of work that we've done previously on what goes to kind of sexual safety. So it will be good to pick that up with you.
Thank you. I note as well with the merit awards for doctors, I personally happen to think it's a very flawed system for all sorts of equity reasons, but it's a system we have. I was so surprised that none of our medics have national pay awards, and I wonder whether we are backward about putting people forward, because while it's a system I don't particularly want to play with, it is a system that's there.
That's a good question. We're not backward in putting people forward. It's, I suppose, one, it's a success rate and the amount of effort that you have to put into it. And it's heavily weighted towards certain things, which is the issue we've always had with Clinical Excellence Awards. So it's heavily weighted, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be, towards academia, papers, but people that actually do service change, service development, how you prove that. So yeah, we don't have any, I don't think we've got anyone that's got a national award, probably just, yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions on the People's Committee? No, thank you. In that case, we'll move to Audit and Risk. I think a little bit unfair to ask Damien to lead on this one, but...
So, no, I'm going to pass the baton to you. So, surprisingly, well, I mean, I joined formally only on Friday, so unsurprisingly, I guess I wasn't at the meeting in whenever it was October or September. So I don't intend to comment specifically on the meeting because the only thing I could do would be to read out loud what's in it. Just as a couple of observations on what I've seen as part of my induction. I mean, as far as I can tell, from an audit and risk assurance point of view, that the house is very much in order. I'm impressed with the quality of the processes, controls, the sources of assurance I've heard about. I've had over the past month or so, 25 odd one-to-one discussions online with all sorts of people, ranging from 45 minutes to 15 minutes, I guess, with you, Joe, because I was short of time. The message is very consistent, which is that the culture is strong, the communication is good between people, the triangulation also between non-exec directors, executive directors, all of that works. I'm impressed with the BAF and the structure of the BAF and the depth of the document. I had a one-to-one call with Grant Thornton, our statutory auditors, and I mean, the auditor was just saying, yeah, it's all fine, not worry about it, which is very reassuring. And I mean, the individual I spoke to at Grant Thornton just mentioned that he had other organizations to worry about, but that this one wasn't one on his radar list, which on his radar screen, which I took very positively as new chair of audit. I also had a good discussion with KPMG. Once again, I mean, everything seems to work. We talked about processes and the flow of information between me and them. And on counter fraud, I mean, the function also works well as far as I can tell, and seems very much best practice. So as far as I can tell, as a new joiner, the house is in order. When it comes to the most recent meeting,
I think it's carrying on from that. I think it's a fairly clean report. So, I mean, the only few things I would highlight on Steve's behalf are no overdue actions from internal audits, and that tends to, occasionally we have one for good reason, as Steve would often say, so I shall repeat it. That is not the same. That's not what you see elsewhere. Certainly in my experience, his experience, and I'm sure in Damien's experience. So, that's good. The recent 2 internal audits both received a rating of significant assurance with minor improvement opportunities, which tends to be the overall annual rating we get. So there's nothing in there that causes concern particularly, because we like to stay at that rating. The other thing, final thing I was going to note was that we received a progress update on the external well-led review, which was carried out by GGI, effectively signing off the changes that have done there. I think the key things for that were the reconfiguration of committees, and in particular the reporting of committees into board, which I think we all agree has made things much more targeted and effective, I think. So that's good.
Thank you. Questions or comments? Thank you, and thank you, Damien, for your observations. And I think, of course, the way in which we've managed this over the years is by not being complacent about it. And I know that we're not complacent, so it's good to congratulate ourselves and be assured of that. But actually, we do it because we keep our nose to the grindstone. So, and I'm sure you will. I know you will be doing that as well. Okay, Joe, a new committee partnership report.
Yes, so really, this is the report from our latest SLP meeting. Again, I will take as read. So key thing, I think, for me, we had a strategic review of the Adult Secure Provider Collaborative. So it's quite a good opportunity to sort of look back and look forward. And I think of all the provider collaboratives we participate in through the SLP, I mean, I would say this is the most successful. It's always been clinician-led. That's not, and I think where we've made changes and improvements, there's been really good clinical leadership and agreement from clinicians. And you can see, there's further enhancements that we would like to do. This provider collaborative, has the ability to finance those, which is positive. The one thing I would say, and it's not in the report, is we weren't necessarily happy about the amount of, well, the complete dearth actually of equality data that was coming through from that strategic review. I think it is something, one of the work streams of our Fitness for the Future work, which is also referred to in here, is to get consistency in terms of reporting data and such like. And given our shared objective to improve inequalities, we need to make sure that we're getting that data through. So that was a sort of a takeaway from that. Other than that, I wasn't going to pick up anything else in the report.
Thank you. If there are no questions, thank you for that. I'll move on to the Council of Governors update. I largely want to take that as read, because many of the items are being covered elsewhere, or are implicit in what we've done elsewhere, such as the nomination committee. I just really want to note and place on record for the board our thanks to Sue, who stepped down at the annual members meeting on the 23rd of October. And thank you for all of her work, and for her work also in helping me have a soft landing in the trust. So thank you very much indeed. Are there any questions about the Council of Governors meeting? In that case, I will move on. In that case, I'll move on to the review of the meeting, and ask people and be interested in everyone's observations, but perhaps also particularly Damien's, as a new face to it, as how this meeting went. Did we have the discussions that we need to hold the organisation to account, and to also think about the strategy to drive it forward? People's thoughts. We didn't have a reflective bit at the beginning of this meeting, in a way, because I think we had I think there would have been overkill on top of the discussions that we had, but also those discussions that we had at the beginning. Let's include that with the wider one. Did people find that was a useful format? I'm getting nods around the table. Yes, Anita.
Yeah, I'll just say it was quite invigorating in the morning. It's great to, we do have the strategic away days and things. This was quite focused as well, and it was quite energizing to sort of engage and think about what we can do.
Rachel.
Realise how much more invigorating it is to hear about external developments and then think, what do we want to do about them, rather than just being in receipt of this is what's happening. It's
Thank you. Abby.
I think it's also good to create the headspace. So the reflective practice the last time, and then doing that before the board and the extended CDs and service directors just gives us a bit of headspace to discuss these things and sort of have a plan and how they link in with our strategy, and to just keep informing what we do.
Thank you. I still need to get to learn to use these buttons right. Thank you. Forward agenda then, Sally. We have a forward agenda. Is there anything you want to say to it particularly?
Just that I will be reviewing the document for 2025. So any comments, people come back to me, and I'll have an updated one for the board meeting in January.
Thank you. Sophie?
I know we're going to get the new templates for the different committee meetings, which will include the connections to the strategy. When is that going to be happening, please?
We'll be sending those out, I think later this month we can do that.
Okay. Any other business? No. In that case, thank everybody for their attention, and I will bring this part one meeting to an end, and ask Steve to, if he's still online, to stop recording. I think we carry on this channel for Nina, don't we? But we stop recording